All right, thanks, Shannon. And thanks to those of you that have joined us. Good evening. I'm Kurt Melcher. I'm the director of the Department of Fish and Wildlife here. And a shout out to Bill and Donna Chachis. I see you in the waiting room there, so to speak. So as Shannon mentioned, we typically have done these meetings through a series of actual in-person town halls around the state, and I always look forward to those. Look forward to meeting folks in person. Unfortunately, this year, well, actually in 2020, we did not hold any town hall meetings because we just had them scheduled in person, and then we went through the total lockdown there, and so we did not have any town hall meetings in 2020. And this year, because we were uncertain on when we were reopening our offices and what the COVID situation was going to be, we planned to do these virtually. And so thanks for bearing with us. Just did want to say there's a lot of really exciting things going on at ODFW. And for those of you who've been paying attention over the last two biennia, we've seen significant new investments at ODFW, largely state general fund investments, both in beginning of the 2019 session, with the implementation of an aggressive anti-poaching campaign that's general fund funded, as well as a new Oregon Conservation and Recreation Fund program that also received general fund in 2019. And then as we moved into the 2021 legislative session, and then again here just recently in the 2022 legislative session, we saw significant additional general fund investments in those programs, as well as notably in reestablishing our habitat division, funding that with state general fund, as well as adding additional habitat biologists in the field, and new investments related to drought response, as well as many others. And then of course at the federal level, the Recovering America's Wildlife Act continues to move through Congress. And when that passes, that would generate about $25 million per year of revenue to the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife for implementing our Oregon conservation strategy. So with that, Shannon, I'm gonna hand the virtual microphone back to you and let you continue with the presentation, and then looking forward to answering any questions. Or you don't have to have questions, you can also just have comments about what your priorities or what your ideas might be. So thanks a lot. Take it away, Shannon.
Great, thank you, Kurt. All right, so again, public engagement is really important to our budget development. And so we have an outline here for you tonight of basically organization structure. Next slide, please. Forget to say that. We'll look closely at, a little bit how the agency is laid out, just to orient folks. And then we have particular attention paid this budget development cycle to our recruitment, reactivation, and retention program. That's R3, and how we engage with communities. And I'll cover that. And then I'll segue over to Brandy, who will go into detail about the budget preparations, and what we're looking at for 23-25 as we develop an agency requested budget. And then, yes, I'll highlight the next steps, which are several more opportunities for public comment, and then we'll take that question and discussion. Next slide, please. So agency organization, we're of course an executive agency, so we are under the governor's office. Our 7-person commission is appointed, each person is appointed by the governor, and then our commission appoints the director. We have 2 deputies in Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'm the Deputy Director of Administration, and my name is Shannon Hearn, if you don't know me. And I oversee the administrative side. So that's human resources, information systems division. We have a management resources that works on project development and budget development and information management. We also have an administrative side of the house, as many executive agencies do, that look at procurement, accounting, contracting, etc. The big one that most folks may not put in the administrative side, we have our information and education programs on the administrative side of the house. our licensing system is on this side of the house as well. And then on the other side, we have the Deputy Director of Fish and Wildlife Programs. That's Debbie Colbert. She oversees the Fish Division and Wildlife Division, and then our newly formed Habitat Division as of last biennium. And she also oversees the regions, which I'll touch more on that structure here in a minute. The one thing I really want to call out on this slide, another thing I really want to call out, is that link between the director and the Oregon State Police. So the Oregon State Police is a whole nother agency. We are not a state fish and wildlife agency that has the biological side and the enforcement side under one agency. But of course, we help fund through license dollars, the public's license dollars, Oregon State Police, the Fish and Wildlife Division, to enforce wildlife laws. And that'll be touched on later in Brandy's presentation as well. So overall, within this agency, we have a little over 1,300 positions. We have a lot of seasonal staff. When you calculate that into full-time positions, that's a little under 1,200 positions. Next slide, please. So if you look at the framework of the agency and our field makeup, we have two regions now. On the left-hand side in the blue is the West region, and then of course on the right is the East region. Within those regions, they're broken down into 10 watershed districts with watershed managers. And then we have 24 fish and wildlife districts that have fish and then wildlife staff for each of those district responsibilities and fish management actions. And there's multiple field offices across the state to house them. We also have 22 wildlife areas, 35 hatchery facilities that we either own or manage, many of those for the federal government, and 4 screen shops. That's a lot of infrastructure, and I'll touch on that here in a little bit. Then, as I said, a little over 1,300 positions, 844 of those are in the region, and that's where you want your staff who are working with local communities and engaging on fish and wildlife management. Next slide. So as I mentioned previously, we have an extra emphasis this year in our budget development about our R3 program, and really an emphasis about community engagement. So I wanted to highlight that early in the presentation, and I'm going to highlight it again at the end. Next slide, Brandy. So we know as an agency that we depend on all Oregonians to support our mission, and our mission is to protect and enhance Oregon's fish and wildlife and their habitats for use and enjoyment by present and future generations. So we developed an R3 program. It was actually U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that kind of coined this phrase, but many state agencies were seeing a decline in participation and connection to the outdoors. So it was really a look at recruiting, retaining, and reactivating outdoor recreationalists. And the goal is, of course, to create new participants. And as you can see, there's a wide host of activities that are dependent on healthy fish and wildlife populations. That's hunting, angling, wildlife viewing, photography. Hikers want to see wildlife and have positive interactions. But really what we've seen is when you engage with folks and try and make them participants, even if they don't become a long life hunter, angler, etc., they still do develop a connection with the outdoors, and they really get this strong sense of why good fish and wildlife management is needed and why investment is needed there. And then of course, education and interpretation can't be overlooked as one of those activities you can do in the outdoors. Oregon, of course, has outdoor school. There's many opportunities to engage Oregonians and folks traveling to Oregon on the importance of our fish and wildlife. Next slide, please. So what we've been asked to do by the governor's office is to really look at enhanced community engagement this budget session. And so each administration, each governor has really stood up kind of their own diversity, equity, and inclusion office. And so Governor Brown has had one, Kitzhaber had one, Kulingoski had one. And recently, the legislature codified that a racial justice council under that diversity, equity, and inclusion office. And so it's the Racial Justice Council that's looking at how to further our engagement in the communities. And of course, one of the communities that we really need to look at and target our focus at is those that are traditionally underrepresented. And that includes BIPOC communities. And if you're not familiar with that term, that's Black, Indigenous, people of color, communities. And so what does it look like when you have traditional users and then you have this targeted outreach? Really, the goals are very similar. So the goals of enhanced community engagement for us really is to improve awareness of our mission and the work that we do on behalf of all Oregonians. We definitely want to increase and diversify people's use and enjoyment of the outdoors, and make that connection with them. But most importantly, with BIPOC communities, we want to develop trusting and enduring relationships so we can learn from them about how they want to be engaged with and what their interests are, so that we can have this more meaningful, targeted approach. Next slide, please. So again, focusing really on relationships. I mentioned having local staff out in the field has been critical to doing our work. We recognize those are the folks that have and develop these relationships. So here at headquarters, we have an R3 program and we have a coordinator, but really this is work that needs to be done throughout the agency. So we're relying on kind of these ad hoc relationships, if you will, that exist, but we're also looking at expanding our educational offerings to underserved population and BIPOC communities, and really focusing those efforts around maybe producing them in their native languages, different than English, if that's not their first language. And also making materials, outreach, and informational regulations, things like that, more accessible to them in their preferred languages. We also are looking to recruit members of those communities who actively hunt, angle, wildlife view. We have the Beaver State podcast, and we've highlighted several leaders of BIPOC communities that engage in those outdoor activities to really explain what it is that brought them into that activity and how they conduct it safely, and why, you know, that's made their life more enjoyable having that opportunity. And really, we want them acting as ambassadors. And the overall goal at the end of the day is really to get, you know, these underserved folks and BIPOC communities and others empowered to be ambassadors, and also to volunteer within their own communities to host events, classes, and workshops to make everyone comfortable with being in the outdoors and realize that this is open for everyone and very inclusive. So specifically around our public engagement this time, we're really asking folks who are close to those communities or part of those communities, what do you think the interest in the outdoor recreation is for you or others that you're close to? And what kinds of support would better help you enjoy and protect Oregon's fish, wildlife, and its habitats? So we've really given emphasis on that at some of our meetings. We're hoping to get feedback specifically on that. All right, next slide. So at this point, we'll segue deep into the budget, just as we promised and highlighted in the town hall news release, and I'll turn it over to Brandy.
All right, thanks, Shannon. Hi, everyone. I'm Brandy Nichols, our Budget and Economics Program Manager here at ODFW. So I'll start with just a high-level overview of the state budget development timeline. State agencies budget on a biennial or two-year basis. So the bienniums begin July 1st of odd-numbered years, and they wrap up June 30th of the following odd-numbered year. So right now on this timeline, we're in that first box working on developing ODFW's budget request for the 2023-25 biennium. And with that development work, we analyze and review a variety of factors. We work on forecasting what costs are to maintain our existing services. We analyze our licensing revenue and possible need of a fee increase in order to maintain those current business existing service level operations. And this is where we also look to identify any program enhancements and new funding that we may want to request as part of our budget package. And I know Shannon mentioned this earlier, I'll say it again too, there are various opportunities for public engagement during budget development, both now, including the session that we're doing here this evening, and involved in those later steps along the way. And we review and consider input and feedback that is offered and look for ways to be able to incorporate that into our final agency request budget package. And so near the end of this presentation, we'll go over with you and share more information on where those opportunities lie and how to access them. So, oops, I always do that. I'm sorry. I advanced my slide too soon. In June, we're still on the timeline. So in June, ODFW will present its agency request budget package to the Fish and Wildlife Commission for their review and approval, so that we are then able to submit our final budget package into the State Chief Financial Office there by the end of August. So we jump ahead to the start of the new year, and at that time, right around the first of the year, so the governor will present their budget recommendations to the Oregon legislature. A legislative session will kick off in February of 2023. And with the end of that legislative session, we will come out with approval from the legislative committee of a budget for our 2023-25 biennium. So I know that was quick. I intended that just to be an overview of this timeline to get us started. The rest of our discussion this evening is going to go into more detail about the review and analysis we've done to plan for the upcoming biennium. There, now we're ready for this slide. So last biennium, 2019-21, closed with a $57 million license fund ending balance. Our agency's ongoing analysis and budget planning involves maintaining a healthy and strong license fund balance. And so a question that might come to your mind is why? Why do we need that? First off, license funding is the starting point and the biggest component of unrestricted cash for our agency. And it's this unrestricted cash that helps mitigate against revenue volatility. ODFW experiences both seasonality and variability with its license revenue due to factors that can be difficult to predict. Many of our programs are partially or fully supported by funding that comes through funding agreements with federal and non-federal entities. And there is a time lag between when those contracted expenditures incur and need to be paid, and when we see reimbursement, when we receive reimbursement from those funding entities. So in spite of this revenue volatility, we do have regular operating expenses that need to be covered. And so that $57 million that I mentioned that we closed last biennium with, that provides about 4.5 months of that operating reserve for us. So additionally, our license fund balance can help us respond to unexpected situations that may come up with an unexpected cost and not have to immediately affect our current business operations in order to respond. And as we will see in later slides, our license balance can also help with flexibility when we look to plan future fee schedules. So this graph shows a visual history of our agency cash balance from 2008 through earlier this year, 2022. Across the agency, we have focused efforts to build and maintain our license fund balance. And this graph really highlights those efforts, particularly from the last 6 years. So we'll move into our current biennium budget, so 2021-23. And these graphs give a visual overview of that budget. So as you can see, our budget is made up of a complex funding structure with multiple revenue sources. So on the left, we have budgeted revenue by type of funding. So kind of going around the circle of these pie graphs, general fund and state lottery fund proceeds make up about 11% of our total agency budget. The purple wedge there for federal funds, that funding comes from excise taxes on fishing and hunting related equipment. And so this is where our Pittman-Robertson funding and our sportfish restoration funding is represented on this graph. And just the wedge combines those two funding sources together. So for a little additional context, our sportfish restoration funding has been averaging about $8 million per year in recent years. And so times two for a biennium. And our Pittman-Robertson funding has been averaging about $16 million per year. However, with the 2022 apportionment, we saw a sizable increase in our PR funding to where we received over $20 million with that year's apportionment. So looking at that wedge of the PR and SFR funding, you look at that along with the green wedges along the right of that pie graph that make up our hunting and angling license revenue. Right about half of our agency's funding is attributed to hunting and angling activities. So in this chart, the other wedge for federal funds and that green wedge labeled obligated, those two slices include that revenue from grants and contracts with various federal and non-federal entities. And one note about that funding, much of it comes with a specific use indicated in their funding agreements that we need to make sure that we use the funding in the way that it's spelled out. So on the right side of this slide is a pie chart that shows our budgeted expenditures by our various program areas. So those green wedges along the right, those make up our fisheries management and conservation programs. The blue wedges there along the bottom make up our wildlife management and conservation programs, along with the agency's new habitat division that was established with this biennium's budget. The purple wedges at the top make up our capital budgeting with a slice immediately over to the left of it for the debt service costs that are associated with capital financing. Those two brown wedges make up our agency's administrative programs. And then to round out this chart is the wedge there for state police. And that slice represents the cost of those enforcement activities that the Fish and Wildlife Division of Oregon State Police provides for us. So with each biennium's budget development, as we plan for the upcoming budget period, we review both the agency's funding sources and those forecasted costs of doing business. So as we saw, State General Fund and Lottery Fund are both funding components of our budget, not real large, but important nonetheless. And as we saw on the earlier timeline slide, the overall state budget development process is really just getting started. With the most recent state revenue forecast that was published in February, the outlook for general fund and lottery funds remains strong, both through this current biennium and through 2023-25. The State Office of Economic Analysis refreshes their revenue forecasts 4 times throughout the year. And so what that means is with the coming 2023 legislative session, the governor's office and the state legislature will have access to and use updated revenue forecasts in order to make their budgeting decisions for the upcoming biennium. Now, at just over 50% of the agency's expenditures, personal services is our main cost driver in maintaining current business operations. So for budget planning, an increase of 8% per biennium is estimated with personal services costs. And this increase factor is attributed to different items, including rising healthcare costs and state compensation plan adjustments, such as pay step increases for employees and cost of living adjustments. So as I mentioned earlier, right about half of ODFW's revenue comes from hunting and angling participants through both license sales and the federal excise taxes on fishing and hunting related equipment. So this graph illustrates hunting and angling participants through the end of last year through 2021. And you can see in the trend line graphs, the strong participation that we saw in both 2020 and 2021 are reflected here. And as Shannon went through and talked about during our community engagement section, ODFW is focusing its efforts around R3 and community engagement to help maintain participants' increased interest that we saw over these last 2 years and keep that going out into the future. So this graph then takes those participant trends that we've seen through 2021 and illustrates a forecast of hunting and angling participants in the coming years. This forecast was done using exponential triple smoothing. This method uses prior year's data as the base or starting point. and accounts for trend effects seen in the data and for time. This method also gives greater weight in the forecasted years to trends that are seen during the most recent years of the actual data. And so we'll take this review of participation trends and this forecast of maintaining our current business operations, the cost of doing that, and bring that in to do an analysis of our license spending and our forecasted license ending balance. So in this graph, the gray line represents expenditures that maintain current business operations within our license funded programs. The blue line represents hunting and angling license revenue. You can see that the line branches into two with the forecasted years. This illustrates two different revenue scenarios that we analyzed. And I'll note here, both of these scenarios were set up with no fee increases included. The first scenario, illustrated with the solid line, gives more weight in the forecasted years to those higher participation trends that we saw in 2020 and 2021. The second scenario, which is illustrated with the dotted line, assumes a slowdown of participation trends over the forecasted years. And so we bring that forecast of expenditures and forecast of revenue down to the green line, which represents our forecasted license fund balance at the end of 2023-25 under each of those two revenue scenarios. This line, of course, also branches into two, solid and dotted, corresponding with the different scenarios I just went through. So I'm sure you noted that graph does show that expenditures are expected to outpace revenue. So we are looking at spending from our license fund balance during the coming biennium. However, this is where the efforts that we have focused to build and maintain that strong, healthy license balance pay off for us. So our current revenue projections, combined with that carryover balance from the end of the last biennium, maintain a sufficient license fund balance for us through the end of 2023-25. We're forecasting to end the budget period that we're in now, the 2021-23 biennium, with $53 million, and to end the 2023-25 biennium with between $32 million and $37 million. So this equates to 4 months of operating reserve available at the end of this biennium and 2.5 to 3 months available for us at the end of next biennium. So with that strong, healthy license fund balance, we are again able to delay a fee increase for recreational licenses. This would then make nearly 10 years since the last request for an increase. Typically, ODFW asks for a fee increase every 6 years. Our last increase was approved in the 2015 legislative session and then implemented incrementally in 2016, 2018, and 2020. So we refresh this analysis each biennium, both as part of our ongoing budget management and with planning for the next budget period, planning for the coming biennium's budget development. Our next opportunity to request a fee increase, if one is needed, will be with the 2025 legislative session. And so with that, I will turn it back over to Shannon to give us an overview of policy option packages and their part in budget development.
Thanks, Brandy. Yeah, reflecting back on a couple of things, as Brandy just described very well, you know, we take a look back at our previous biennial budget and where we've ended up. And so that becomes our base budget looking forward. And then we have a bunch of adjustments through either salary packages, what we got in the latest session, which in this case is 2022. And we refine that with the instructions from DAS, and we get a current service level budget. And then you add to that policy option package, and that becomes your agency request budget, which is what our Fish and Wildlife Commission will be asked to approve in June. So we can send it fully to DAS. And in years where we're not recommending that the agency pursue a recreational license increase, we don't have a lot of public engagement on our budget. But where we see a lot of comments, if we get them, is around policy option packages. And that's because this is really kind of the investment in new programs, new directions, new initiatives that people really get excited about and take an interest in. And as Director Melcher mentioned, we're really looking for comments on these. We've drafted these policy option packages for new programs, really centered around conversations we've had with stakeholder groups, what we saw during the last session, what we know is likely going to be governor's initiatives, although it's a little hard to forecast when we're changing governors here at the end of the year. And so it's really our attempt at drafting something we think moves the dial for fish and wildlife management, but we do modify things significantly every year, every biennium, based on the input we get during this budget development process. And so there's two buckets of POPs, and that's why we can call them POPs. There's continuation POPs, and then there's new programs, new initiative POPs. And again, I think it generates a lot of excitement because it's really us looking forward towards the future. And in addition to that, I mentioned we have a lot of infrastructure. So this is a place, in the past, we've gotten a lot of public input of people asking what we're doing around maintenance of our facilities. And POPs is where we put in the bonding if we want to do capital construction or major acquisitions or deferred maintenance. And it just garners a lot of attention, and we appreciate that attention. So next slide. So this year, in kind of looking at what priorities and initiatives are going on and where the interest really lies with our stakeholder groups, we've landed on these package themes for POPs. And so if you count the number of packages, we've got about 34, it's 60 positions. And we're trying to capitalize on what may be a significant amount of federal funding, as Director Melcher touched on as well. So most of that federal funding requires some type of match, whether that's license or general fund. And so we build these as draft POPs, and they will have a lot of refinement between now and approval by the commission, but also going into the governor's recommended budget, and then of course through legislative session. So always a starting point. I just want to highlight that significantly, because we want to hear what folks' priorities are when they're commenting on our budgets around these POPs. And so looking back at themes, you've already heard me talk about the R3 program, and diversity inclusion is a big one for executive agencies in our agency right now. We just stood up a habitat division. So we're really looking at, have we fully set that up, right? Do we have enough resources there to take on the real initiatives around what's going to happen here very soon with climate change, drought, wildfire, et cetera, impacts coming into the state, so we can adequately engage. And then water is a big one. So you'll see, besides this flow restoration and measurement, water planning POP, most of these other fish research, fish passage and screening are related to this water and the water issues we will have with availability here down the road. And then as you build more program, you really do need to look at your business function, your efficiencies, and how you're supporting both internally and externally customers. And so core agency support has become a big theme. If you're really adding significantly to your agency, you need to consider what support you have. I'll touch a little bit about infrastructure. That's been a theme for quite a while on the deferred maintenance side, and we're continuing that. There also are some special infrastructure projects. And then in any budget, there's always this budget reconciliation about the number of positions you have or are programs funded correctly. So we have a few of those to make budget adjustments. Next slide. So as I mentioned, there's two types of POPs essentially. One is continuation and one is new POPs. So I'll run through these in pretty much detail. I might start skipping later on because it gets a little harsh. But again, I just want to point out that we have a slide deck out there that describes each of these individually and talks exactly about how many positions are going into them, what they would do in a funding source. So I won't cover that for you, but I'll give you a sense of these. The first one listed here under that infrastructure theme is the deferred maintenance. And as I mentioned, this is our agency strategy for continuing that dialogue around deferred maintenance for our facilities out there. We have almost 86 facilities, from hatcheries to wildlife areas to field offices to headquarters, et cetera. So that's a big maintenance log. And what we've done is in phase one, we went for a $10 million bond. We were granted that by the legislature, and that went into hatchery maintenance. And then we did phase 2, which we just got in the last biennium that we're still implementing. And that went to regional and field offices. And then now we're submitting for phase 3. So another 5 million, and we'll continue on this list. We have a real property manager now who we also obtained that position in the last biennium, who can really kind of assess and work with field managers on that need. And we just prioritize it that way. Director Meltzer talked about the Oregon Conservation Strategy and investments made there. So the legislature made a big investment in development of the Oregon Conservation and Recreation Fund. That fund has a committee that when those funds come in to that account, they review grants and put it down on the ground for fish and wildlife habitat and outdoor recreation. And so that's been in 2 biennium. And now we're looking to put a position on that acts as a coordinator to keep that going, similar to Access and Habitat Program or Restoration and Enhancement Program. So that's a continuation pop to keep that going. And then the Farm Bill biologist. So this is a great opportunity where we have the federal government investing in working with landowners to improve fish and wildlife habitat, but they don't have enough resources, and resources being people in this case, to kind of liaison with landowners and put that money on the ground. So they pay for these positions, and then they act between the agency and NRCS and the landowners as the mechanism for getting that funding in Oregon. And then near and dear to my heart always is the Good Neighbor Authority coordinators. So I think about 6 years ago, we signed a Good Neighbor agreement at the state between that and US Forest Service. And we have an older one with BLM, but we have the opportunity here again to use federal money to improve fish and wildlife habitat and look at where's the best way to spend money on forest as you're rehabbing meadows or doing timber sales and restructuring the forest setting. And so our coordinators liaison with US Forest Service to talk about where that would be most beneficial. Department of Forestry has similar positions. We liaison with them. It's been a really nice coordinated effort, and it's done a lot of great work. Same thing with the Culvert Fish Passage POP. This now is on 2 biennium as well. ODOT has obviously many culverts that they're required to replace. And then they have a fish passage and screening requirement like anyone out there when you're modifying a culvert. And so this acts as a mitigation bank. So you can really look at where you can benefit removing culvert for native fish to offset impacts of one that maybe may not be as beneficial or maybe too costly at the time when it's being modified. And then if you look at fish research and restoration, these are continuation POPs because this is a lot of ongoing efforts. I'll talk about the Klamath one first. Everyone's aware of the Klamath Dam removal potentially. We have had this in biennium request. This will be the 3rd one, so 2 prior to this, to have a coordinator available to work on what it means when those dams come out and what it means for anadromous fish returning. We also have a great need and have been working with the federal government for some time to improve our salmon forecasting and habitat models. And so as water resources get tighter and tighter, where will you see fish move and still have access to habitat year after year after year? And then as I mentioned, we always have reconciliation packages. This year we just have 2. One is a research position package where we've been using seasonals for a long time to do wildlife research, and this really is just making them permanent and using those positions correctly. So there's no funding involved. It really is just the change in the positions. And then I really want to highlight the last one on the continuation pods. About 4 years ago, sounds right, the legislature made a huge investment in an anti-poaching initiative. And so Oregon State Police, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and Department of Justice were all funded through that package. And what we got was to really run the campaign and a coordinator, and OSP got some resources. What Department of Justice got was an additional position to prosecute when cases went to them, or assist with prosecution when cases moved that far along. So they got the position authority, but somehow the funding, not somehow, it was dedicated funding to us, and we were divvying it out to OSP and DOJ. We've just found now that the position is becoming permanent, let's cut out the middleman. We'll give the money directly to them. really is just a shift. And the only reason I want to highlight this is just to make sure people know there's no changes in what is happening. DOJ still gets money and they're still active in this. OSP is still doing their work under the funding. Their positions are still there too, and so does ODFW. So it's not really a net loss, it just goes directly to DOJ. Next slide. Okay, here's where I might start moving along a little bit faster. Just this list is pretty lengthy, and everyone's time is important. So I'll highlight on a couple of them, and then I'll show you where the larger slide deck is here in about 4 slides. So as I mentioned, diversity and inclusion, big emphasis in Oregon and executive agencies. We find that we have a lot of initiatives going on. We have a lot of work out in the field. We have a lot of good things happening. It would be our recommendation that we have a coordinator that really kind of looks across the state about what's happening, where we're prioritizing this work, and pulls it all together and maybe does a better job messaging what is happening out to our external stakeholders. And then in this diversity, inclusion, and theme, we also have another position, which is what's called a language access coordinator. And what we're learning as we're engaging with underserved communities, and especially non-English speaking first language folks, is that it really is moving the needle when you have a position and a person who speaks, whatever the language is that goes to that community and speaks directly to them. Like they feel much more comfortable and they feel much more engaged with. In Oregon, we happen to have Spanish speaking citizens as a large body, but we also have Russian. They're very large. And I think if you look at a nationwide map about the second most common languages, Russian may still show up for Oregon. We also have a Korean population. And so how do we refine our materials, both in outreach and regulations and other things informational to them, having someone who has this knowledge and dedicated time in their position to do that would be really advancing our efforts. I mentioned core agency support, so you can see, human resource analysts and additional contract specialists. That's us growing the agency and needing that additional support for our internal staff support as well as external. I mentioned a lot of federal money coming in. Those always are a big grant, but when you go to administer that federal money out on the ground, it's a lot of additional agreements and contracts to make sure that the federal rules are followed as well as the state rules, and that the work gets done. Cybersecurity has been a big issue, especially if you've looked at the news. So we're wanting to beef up our programs here that protect the data that we have. And obviously we have some very sensitive data when we're selling licenses that we would like to keep secure. Big one for us is we have 2 websites. One is the DFW website, and then we also have a myodfnw.com. So DFW website has grown, and it's just programs pushing out a significant amount of information that we think the public would want to know. And we know they're using it to the millionth page hit degree. Like they are using it significantly. And they're also using myodfnw.com, which is wholly focused just at hunting, angling, and wildlife viewing opportunities for now. But we really need some resources to look at this ODFW website, the DFW one, and determine what's being used, what content needs to stay. I'll tell you, if we take something down, we almost immediately hear it from the public. So we know it's being used, but what's the best streamlined method we could to engage with them on web page by web page is what this person, or 2 actually people analysts, would look at. I'm going to touch on climate change, and I'm going to do it over a course of 4 or 5 pops here. So climate change occurring, droughts occurring, changing ocean conditions. We really want enhanced communication around that. And we also want significant investments in staff that are measuring stream temperature and modeling water systems and engaging with water resources department in their planning. So you can see that in both the climate habitat communication support, the hydrography data coordination. We've got the integrated water resources solution pop here, the statewide stream temperature monitoring. There's just a big effort right now, really, that the agency needs to be a part of so that water considerations for fish and wildlife are adequately considered. I've touched on habitat, so I'm going to skip on that one. Fish passage and screening and research. We really are, and I'll do this pretty holistically, looking at our fish passage and screening program and both having resources to help landowners as they are modifying their structures, but also to model where we have fish habitat distribution and where these barriers exist, and how they modify that fish habitat so that we can adequately prioritize where the funding goes in addressing them and making this huge investment as a state. We're hoping some more federal money injection there. We've seen a little bit through private forest accord. We anticipate more coming through a couple of other acts that have passed recently on infrastructure. So fingers crossed for that. Under fish research and restoration, we finally finished the Rogue South Coast Winter Stillhead Monitoring Plan. Huge effort with a lot of public engagement. Hats off to staff for doing that. We did get some funding through a bill this last legislative session, so we can get going on the effectiveness and monitoring requirements a part of that program. So we need the positions for that. We also have seen in the Coquille River huge impacts to salmon from the smallmouth bass population that's expanding. So we're looking for a few more positions there. I've already touched on Klamath, so there's additional research and monitoring for the anadromous return. Skipping down, emerging species issues. We do have several emerging species issues. This highlights some POPs that are built around them. One of those specifically is the mule deer population decline that we've seen in Oregon. And so Wildlife Division is asking for a position that would really work on the mule deer plan, and then work with our East Region wildlife research sector and adding some more positions and focusing some more research directed at mule deer over the next couple of years that would actually feed into that plan. We have whale entanglement issues and a fish management plan being developed on the coast. And so there's resources there to continue on with that plan and also monitor the use and not the use of that plan by the industry, but also their compliance with what's requested under the new guidance provided by the commission, and that will be provided in that plan. A big one to highlight is wildlife coexistence program. We've heard from several Biennia this real look at urban environments and the interactions between humans and wildlife, and human and wildlife, and how we can better improve the human side's understanding of how to live with wildlife. And so this coexistence program actually comes with some positions that interface in urban areas, but also a campaign so people can really understand, their request about living with wildlife, giving them the space, using non-lethal tools, etc., to improve the impacts that they're seeing in their neighborhoods overall. I'll touch on wildlife areas because I think especially in the Northeast, one might be of significant interest. The Biennium River Wildlife Area acquisition, this is now in phase 2. This is the funding limitation, hopefully to complete the second phase of acquiring that property. Anyone who knows that area knows, well, this is a real gem in that area. It sits right above Biennium, above this state, Oregon State Parks property. It would allow public access into the Eagle Cap Wilderness. And it really is a benefit to habitat, or to wildlife habitat and fish habitat that are present on that property. And I think I'll end it there. I actually went further through the list than I have any other night. So next slide, please. So I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about putting together an agency request budget if I didn't mention our statutory obligation to put together a 10% reduction list. In some biennium, this is pretty critical because we do get reductions required in our budget. So this really is a look at the current service level, and then by fund type, you take 10%, and it's in statute that we have to look 10% across all fund types. We develop this kind of later in our budget as other products are developed, including the current service level budget, so we can predict how much we're looking for here. The other thing that's reason why it's developed late is we have a very public process with our budget. And so once this list gets posted, our staff can see it. And we want to have time to actually notify staff so that they're aware their positions might be indicated on this reduction list. So what I have to offer tonight really is what these targets are going to be very close to. We use the 21-23 biennial budget. And as you can see, general fund would be 4.1 million if you took a 10% reduction. Lottery fund would be 643,000. Other fund is coming in at 21.6 million, and federal funds would be 15.3 million. Now, we would always anticipate it's very unlikely that the Oregon State Legislature would ask us to not take in federal funds, but they really could ask us to take reduction in some of these other pots. So we take this exercise very seriously. We're working on it currently, and it will be part of the June commission packet. Next slide, please. So wrapping things up, like I promised, we'll talk about where additional resources are and how to comment. Next slide. As I mentioned, our main website, the dfw.state.or.us, has this agency budget information. It's always under our main page if you go to About Us, and then there's the budget link. In addition to the slide deck that's really much more detailed than what we've provided tonight, there are summary materials that kind of orient you around what our fund types mean and where they come from. There's also kind of a quick overview of the last budget, so you can see what the base budget is. And then one thing I've been pointing people to is the budget white paper that's sitting there. It's a good document, and an overview is probably better our divisions and what's in them, as well as our regions and what programs we have, and statutorily where the funding comes from or is supposed to be dedicated to, not supposed to be, is dedicated to. Next slide, please. So like I mentioned, we're kind of in the middle of our public process here. So we're letting folks know we'll take any input. You can email us at odfw.commission@odfw.oregon.gov, and that's all over our website. We also still take comments and questions by mail. What we do with this, however, is we compile it in its original format, however it comes into the commission packet. We don't modify, cut, or paste anything at all. And then we provide that to the commission to review as part of their decision making. And we also are taking input because we're modifying and building that agency request budget. So we have one more of these to do tomorrow on the virtual listening sessions. And then we'll have 2 Fish and Wildlife commissions. So we'll have a meeting in May that's single topic, where we'll present more materials on the budget and the public can testify at there, and we're hoping folks do. And then we'll have a full exhibit as usual at the June commission meeting, so that the commission can really finalize their prioritization and stamp of approval on our budget. And we'll again take public testimony. And then we need to have that meeting in June, because in July we're building this so that we can submit it to the governor's office in August. And then from there on, it's through the governor's recommended governor's recommended budget process out through the legislature. And we hope to have a final budget 2021. Yeah, July 1, 2023. Next slide. And this is the last one. I just want to thank folks, anyone who hung in there for this and attended. It really is meaningful. We know we don't get a huge amount of participation, especially if we're not putting up a recreational license fee, but it's still meaningful to have any input at all and participation. And then I just want to highlight again, we're really looking for feedback around how we operate our R3 program, how we can better serve underserved populations, including BIPOC communities, and really how we can support anyone's participation in outdoor recreation and their interest in fish and wildlife conservation. And then I always anticipate we'll get some policy option package comments and review, and we really do need those. And then we want to hear recreational license fees. I get it when people want to talk about it because we're proposing it, but when we're not proposing that, it does mean a big change to our ending balance and a look at really what the services we're providing. So we'll take feedback anytime, even when we're not proposing it. So with that, I'll stop here. I think we'll take the slide deck down. And we'll see if we have anyone who wants to raise their hand, throw a comment or a question in the chat. And then we'll bring you over. And like I said, we'll stay here until the questions or the dialogue ends.